Welcome back. We're in Genesis chapter 12, verse 1. Let's go. 12:1. Now the Lord had said to Abram, get out of your country, from your family, and from your father's house. We talked about that yesterday. To a land that I will show you. This is the land of Canaan. We talked about that earlier, and we'll talk about it a little bit more. Verse 2, I'll make you a great nation. This is the Jewish people, right? The nation of Israel. This is going to be a great people that God was going to create, and he did. But the majority of Israel turned their back on God. They worshipped other gods. They didn't receive the Messiah. They didn't believe that God was the one true God. That's problematic, and that's why today you see the majority of Jewish people are people who claim they're Jewish. Number one, they don't know if they're Jewish because all the genealogical records were destroyed in AD 70 when the Romans destroyed the temple. And two, even if they claim that they are Jewish, most of them don't believe in the afterlife. Many of them don't even believe in God. It's more just like a fraternity. But at this point in time, this is a promise. This is something God's talking about. And all of Israel that remains at one point at the very end of the tribulation. This is what will actually bring God back. This is what we're waiting on. So you'll have the rapture, then a 7-year tribulation. At the very end of the tribulation, the nation of Israel will collectively and individually at the same time turn to Jesus. And that's in the city of Jerusalem. You'll have 2/3 of the city that's killed and 1/3 that remains. 2/3 of the city are killed by basically the devil, the Antichrist and his army. And then you'll have 1/3 who cry out to Jesus, and Jesus comes back. He goes to the rock city of Petra, frees the Jewish people who had fled there. This is all during tribulation. And then he goes to Jerusalem and saves the 1/3 who had called out his name. So, little lesson there. So it says, I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great. So we just discussed that we don't want to waste time and effort creating a name for ourselves. So why does God say that he will make Abraham's name great? Do you see that little subtlety? We're talking about not building a name for ourselves. That people tried to do it at Babel and the Tower of Babel, and God dispersed them, confused their language. And yet here he's saying, I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great. So let's talk about this. Today we learn about Abram and we study him. Abram's name is great simply because he chose to trust God. We don't study Abram because he was rich and successful in the eyes of the world. Rather, we study him in awe of his faith. He left his comfort zone, like a missionary or a pastor might leave their comfort zone. He trusted God that he would have children, even though his wife was barren and could not have children. He even screwed up big time by having a child with someone who wasn't his wife. We'll talk about that. And we certainly sit and wonder about how God called him to sacrifice his own son Isaac, and Abram obeyed God. And then God saved Isaac at the very last moment. So we remember Abram not because of his wealth, his worldly success, or his power, but because of his obedience, right? Not because he was a rich philanthropist who put his name on everything and built buildings and gave money and got himself on the news. We remember him because of his faith, and that's why he's in the Faith Hall of Fame. And so maybe we remember that and kind of understand what's going on here. Verse 3 says, I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse him who curses you. So friends of Israel will be blessed. Remember that today, when we live in a world of a ton of people, I'd say the vast majority of the world, even a lot of Americans, even a lot of people who claim to be Christians, unfortunately and incorrectly are anti-Semites who hate the Jewish people. They don't think they should be a nation. They don't think they should be around. They think they should give up the land. That there's the war over there, the Gaza Strip, and all that stuff over there. But God says you will be blessed by blessing Israel. So we are to bless Israel, Israelites, and Jewish people. And so remember that, because you'll get blessing out of that. And it says, I will curse him who curses you. So any enemies of Israel will be cursed. Anti-Semites, for example, will be cursed. There's plenty of presidents of the United States. There's plenty of politicians. There's plenty of pastors who are anti-Semites, and they will have huge consequences for that. And again, we say the word anti-Semite because that's what we know, but it's actually a misnomer because a Semite includes Arabs. And when people say someone's an anti-Semite, it just means against the Israelites, the Jewish people. But we'll go ahead and use that name because that's what people are used to. But don't be an anti-Semite. Don't dislike Jewish people. Love Jewish people. Love them all. I'm going to tell you a story of a book I'm reading right now called Son of Hamas. It's about this person who grew up in a Muslim household over in the Middle East, and you can read the book. It's great. But just last night he was talking about, he thought the Muslims were his friends and that the Israelites were his enemies. He was living in, I think, the West Bank, Gaza Strip. I can't remember, one of those areas right there within Israel on the edge. And you know, they didn't disagree, and still today, on whose territory it is. There's always fights and wars and battles and all sorts of stuff. And he went to prison for maybe a year and a half, something like that, when he was about 17 or 18 years old. And he hated the Israelites. But then he started working with the Israelites, and he realized that they were kind and sweet and sincere. And he said, wait a minute. If you were supposed to be my enemy, but you're kinder and more respectful to me than any Muslim has ever been, then who really is my enemy? And he started seeing the Muslims in the prison that he was in who were torturing other Muslims because they wanted something to do, and they were sticking needles into the fingernails. Absolutely inhumane, despicable, disgusting. And what he was saying is, the Israelites are nice. There's something different about them. And then ultimately he finds Jesus. I'll let you read the book. But don't have enemies. Don't have enemies at all. God calls us to love everyone, to treat everybody as we would treat ourselves, right? As we would want to be treated. So, love Israel, love Jewish people. Don't go against them, because there will be consequences for that. And then it back into verse 3 says, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Jesus the Messiah would come through the line of Abram. And Jesus is the greatest blessing that one could ever receive or imagine. So it says, in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Abram is the exalted father, the father of the nations, and yet his wife is barren and they can't even have kids. And he's having to receive these promises from God, probably saying, what are you talking about? We don't even have a kid. I mean, we've tried, God, but we can't have kids. What's going on? And they're getting older and older. And as you'll see in just a second, he's about 50 to 75 years old as we're reading this. And then in verse 4 it says, so Abram departed as the Lord had spoken to him, and Lot went with him. So that's his nephew. And Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. So Abram lived about 50 years in Ur, and then 25 years in Haran. Then finally ventured to the place that God had called him to, Canaan. Abram leaves Haran at 75, but God spoke to Abram when he was in Ur at age 50. So Abram wasted about 25 years in the wrong place, right? He went from Ur to Haran. He was supposed to go from Ur to Canaan, but he stopped in Haran. It's like stopping at a Buc-ee's or whatever for 25 years. And he's just like, this is cool. This place is nice. And here's the question. How many years have you wasted? Think about it. I can tell you the answer for mine. Mine was 33 years. I was 33 years old when I came to Christ. I wasted 33 years of my life. But watch this. But God can use those wasted years if you demonstrate your faith by actually trusting God and doing what He's called you to do. So looking back, I would argue that they're not wasted years necessarily, but rather learning years. And your testimony will be powerful and will help people understand who you were and what you did before you trusted in God, and what your life looks like now that you're living in obedience to God and experience the peace and joy that comes from that obedience. Despite your earthly circumstances, right? Maybe you have tough earthly circumstances. Maybe you lose a job, you don't get a raise, things go awry, you take a new job that doesn't pay as less, and you're looking around at your earthly circumstances that seem like they're less, but you have more peace and joy because you know that this earth and this life is temporary. And maybe you have even more riches when you come to Christ. But then the question is, what do you do with those riches? How do you bless other people with those riches, or are you just using them for yourself? And then people look at you and they're like, well, he's a Christian, has all this money. Of course he loves God. God's given him everything, right? So those are the things we want to kind of think through. And you'll have to wrestle with on your own. We think about this. We encourage our children most of the time, hopefully. We encourage them rather than accusing them. And God, too, encourages us when we want to grow from being baby Christians into spiritual giants whose lives are defined by our obedience. Think about it. When a baby is learning to walk, it takes a step and everybody's clapping and taking videos with their iPhone and they're so excited and big smiles. And then the kid falls down. You don't go over there and say, "What are you doing, you little wussy? Stand up, stand up." He's like, "What? I'm just learning." And that's what it's like when we're learning to trust God. God's encouraging us. And when we fall, he doesn't walk away from us. His hand's out, just waiting for us to grab it and say, "Let me help you up." But too often we get down on our circumstances. We get sad, depressed. We blame ourselves. We blame other people. We get that lack of forgiveness and that blame and that regret and that guilt that just riddles us and wraps us in further sadness and further depression and further anger. And we don't want to go there. And God doesn't want us to go there. So it's baby steps, right? We come to Christ. And then we learn to grow with him as we learn to walk. And then you start running with him. And you don't even look back. And you're like, there's a hurdle. I'm just going to jump right over it. God's going to help me. And if I hit the hurdle and I fall down, hey, that's okay too. I know God's with me. And I know I'm going to be on this earth for less than, call it 120 years, probably less than 80 or 90 years. I can make it through. And I want to take as many people with me to heaven as I possibly can. Was a place of prosperity and plenty. So it took a lot of faith for Abram to leave it in search of a place he's never known. And to do so simply by faith, because God called him to do it. Remember that we cannot serve two masters. He was being called by God, yet he desired to do something earthly for himself. And that's why he stayed in Haran for 25 years, even after he got the calling and left went to Haran. He's trying to serve two gods. He's like, well, I'm serving you, God. I'm halfway in. I'm not fully there. There's a book by Francis Chan called Halfway Herbert. That's a good book for kids. We used to read it to our oldest son. And God wants us to go all the way, and we can only serve him. Now here's the question, because it's not possible to serve two masters. We know that literally and logically, and we know it because God tells us that in the Bible. And here's the question is the last thing I'll say. Here's the question for most of us Americans. Are we trying to serve two masters? Are we trying to serve both God and manna, both God and money, both God and success, both God and people respecting and revering and worshiping us? And here's the question. Do you have money, or does money have you? Because for Americans, I think that's largely the biggest thing that we struggle with, is kind of keeping up with the Joneses. Do we have money, or does it have us? There's a big difference. Do we have it and we use it for God's glory? We give to the church. We use the money to buy more free time and maybe less work so that we can go out and serve and tell people about Jesus and feed the homeless and do whatever God's calling you to do? Or do we just keep that money? We don't give to the church. We don't give of our time. We build bigger things. We put our name on buildings and stuff. We don't do all this earthly stuff to point to us. That's the question. Does money have you? Do you have money, or does money have you? Lord, thank you for this day. Help us not to be halfway Herberts. Help us not to go halfway. Maybe some of us listening are not even there where I was in my 20s, which is just living my life completely on my terms. And then at 33, when you're like, okay, here's what, I'm here. I've been waiting, Mike. It's time. And then we have this kind of struggle. Do we go halfway with you, Lord, or do we go all the way? You went all the way for us. You came down to earth. You suffered. You were beaten, and you died for us. Lord, help us to go all the way for you and not just halfway. In your amazing name, amen. Thank you so much for listening to Daily Verse by Verse. We want you to be prepared in season and out of season to study the whole counsel of God so that you can share with people who Jesus is through your actions, so that you have the right to tell them who Jesus is, so that they can come to know Jesus or come to know Jesus better. We strongly encourage you to share this message, this podcast, on your social media, Facebook, Instagram, message, email someone who you think could benefit from it. It's an easy way for you to go out and witness to the world just by sharing this podcast. We hope you'll join us tomorrow. Have a wonderful day.